Final Fantasy is one of, if not my absolute favorite video game franchise of all time. I remember first watching my brother play Final Fantasy ampersand, let this be a lesson in releasing Shift, on the PlayStation back when I was, 4 or 5, and then finally playing it for myself a few years later. I then went on to play Final Fantasy 8, Tactics, 10, 12, 6, 3, 13, you probably get the point by now. And now 25 plus years later, after I first grew attached to this franchise, I wanted to return to all of the games and examine how the franchise has evolved over time, as well as finally fill in the couple remaining gaps of games that I've never played. Also to look at the villains found in each of the games, but that's for some other videos. Starting off with the game that spawned it all, Final Fantasy is a fine game. I played it for the first time when I was 18 on my iPod Touch with an incredibly cracked screen during first year chemistry, since a lot of it was just rehashing what I'd done in AP chemistry in high school. That, or writing out the full lyrics to Rick Astley's Never Gonna Give You Up in my friend's notebook until she realizes that I'm just rickrolling her. Now, a quick disclaimer, I was not alive in 1987, so I don't know how actual people thought about it back in the day, and I'm not going to pretend to be able to speak definitively about a time period in which I did not exist. But I have played, we'll say, a couple JRPGs throughout my life, so I feel generally qualified to give my unsolicited opinion on the games. Second disclaimer, I am aware that game development was still in its infancy back then, and the limited technologies and fact that the world had less overall experience in developing games will have impacted the final product. I will be somewhat taking this into consideration, but I can't go back in time almost 40 years and experience this game as people did back then, so I'm mainly going to be talking about how it feels to play today, but while I will be critical about many aspects, I certainly have a lot of respect for what the game did and what later spawned as a result of this game coming out. But I won't be focusing too much on the future games here, there will be plenty of time for that later on. Focusing on this game though, it doesn't actually leave me with a ton of stuff to say. It has a good amount of stuff going on, but none of it is especially deep, which I'm sure you'll hear me mention loads of times throughout the video. I suppose we'll start off by looking at the story. We control the 4 Warriors of Light, who are tasked with rescuing Princess Sarah from Garland, a former knight of Cornelia. He is defeated by the Warriors of Light, and the 4 Fiends of Chaos send him back in time 2,000 years to recover. He creates the 4 Fiends back in this era and sends them into the future where they drain the energy of the 4 elements, enabling a time loop to effectively become immortal. The Warriors of Light defeat the 4 Fiends, save the crystals, and then travel back in time 2,000 years to defeat Garland, who has transformed into chaos once and for all. The story is a fairly interesting concept, but my main issue with it is my summary there already gives you like 90% of it. Like I said a moment ago, decent idea, shallow execution is how I feel about a lot of this game. To the game's credit, it does have a couple smaller storylines, like Asto stealing Matoya's eye so she can't make a potion to cure the Prince of Elfheim, and the Lufenians being kicked out of their home in the sky. But other than mentioning them, the game doesn't really do much else with these storylines, and as such, I never really felt particularly attached to anything that was going on. And I was more just accidentally solving these problems because that's how you were meant to progress the game. And a big thing missing from the game to have me grow attached to these storylines is characters for me to grow attached to. Nobody really has much, if any, personality present. Garland is the one exception where his background is explored a little bit, but given how central he is to the story, he kind of has to be. The Warriors of Light are all complete blank slates without any dialogue. You never meet any characters, it just feels like everyone automatically knows you and makes demands of you the very first time that you talk to them. And then when you do help them out, they just give a relatively generic thank you or vaguely hint at whatever's needed next for progression, rather than actually build any relationships with the player characters. And as a result, it doesn't really feel like the story really goes anywhere for most of the game, and it just happens accidentally as we progress through the dungeons. Rarely does it feel like anything that I did actually had an impact on the world. Beating any of the 4 fiends gives a small cutscene where light is restored to each of the crystals, but there isn't really a whole lot of impact in these scenes, and nothing really feels different in the world after restoring the power of the elements. But story isn't the only important aspect of a video game, and I think exploration and the sense of adventure is where this game shines the most. The story having a lesser involvement means that the game feels a lot faster paced. Since there's very little in the way of dialogue or cutscenes in the middle of dungeons, each area goes by fairly quickly, and you can experience much more of this game's large world in a relatively short time span. Now, obviously this game came out much later, but Suikoden follows a similar principle of kind of rapid-firing dungeons in a large world, allowing you to experience quite a lot of the world while keeping a fairly short runtime. So while the characters and story are a bit lackluster to me, the game does capitalize on the design space opened up by focusing less on those aspects. It's obviously not one, but the game almost feels Metroidvania-like in some aspects. None of the world is really locked by story, you just gradually unlock more and more exploration mechanics as you progress, which gives you access to more and more of the world map. There's definitely an intended order, but at no point does the game say you have to do the crystals in Earth, Fire, Water, Wind order, so it feels a bit more open in its design. And while the canoe may be locked behind the Earth Crystal in defeating Lich, the Levistone and Rosetta Stone are only near the locations of the other fiends and don't actually require defeating them. So I imagine you could tackle the remaining 3 fiends in any order if you really felt chaotic. And heavily related to exploration is the dungeons themselves, but here is where we go back to our motto of solid idea, shallow execution. My big gripe with the dungeons, and realistically any area, including the towns, is just how large and blocky and square soft everything is. Castle Cornelia is a good example where they insisted on including every room in one map, and so every room was forced to be at the same scale as the whole castle, and it just feels like everything sprawls out unnecessarily. And when this happens in the dungeons, this sprawl isn't really accompanied by any significant complexity most of the time. Now, I'm not trying to say that there's nothing unique about any of the dungeons. Each of the 4 main shrines and the Chaos Shrine have their own quirk. The Earth Shrine has a false ending and you need to come back with the Earth Rod. The Fire Shrine has the lava tiles. The Water Shrine wraps around the side of the screen. The Wind Shrine has a more unique layout with lots of gaps everywhere. And the Chaos Shrine 2,000 years in the past has multiple bosses blocking your progression. And also the Citadel of Trials was the most unique, having that warp tile maze on the 2nd floor. These things are alright, but looking forward at even just the next game and you start to see significantly more variability in the dungeon structure. But we'll get to that in the next video. FF1's dungeons are primarily just big and full of encounters. And on the topic of encounters, the encounter rate is quite high, adding a solid amount to the early game tension. And I mean super early, like pre-Lich. At this point, you don't really have much in the way of money, spell slots, or healing items, and so each fight comes with an opportunity cost. Do I use one of my Black Mage's precious spell slots clearing out this 9 enemy encounter, single target them down with my melee classes and heal up afterwards, or flee? Marsh Cave, where you get the crown from, was decently long, and I had to do it in 2 trips so that I could restock on healing items. Antidotes primarily, just so that I didn't die. But before too long, and I think this might be different in the NES version, as you can see I'm playing the Pixel Remaster, money becomes super plentiful and healing items aren't particularly expensive, so you just start swimming in potions and ethers if you're playing the later releases. But as a result, the game kind of loses its tension for the most part as you progress through it. You're just getting spammed with easy encounters unless you disable them, and you have more than enough resources to easily deal with them. and with the sole exception of Chaos and his gargantuan HP pool in the Pixel remaster, the bosses aren't difficult whatsoever, meaning that there isn't really any meaningful decision making to be made after the early game up until you hit the final boss. And so combat just doesn't feel particularly interesting once you get out of the early game hurdles. Combat is really easy and options are limited, so your mid-combat decisions don't feel very impactful. For 90% of the game, your melee attackers are just melee attacking. Later on, ninjas get access to low-level black magic, and so they can help out your setup with, like, temper and haste. And knights get access to Cura if you really need help with the healing, but you're still just clicking attack most of the time. Mages are slightly more interesting as they have access to buffs for most of the game, and sometimes you're figuring out if the enemy has an elemental weakness. Red mages also have the option to attack with weapons. But for the most part, you don't really need to put in much thought to what moves you're selecting. Using attack or the highest level offensive spell or heal if necessary is good enough in just about every scenario. But this isn't necessarily a deal breaker. I've played many games where the mid-combat decision-making isn't particularly interesting, and I was still able to enjoy them. If the pre-combat setup is more involved, like some other games later on in the franchise or the Atelier games, then that planning can make up for a simpler and plainer combat system. So how does FF1 fare in this regard? Unfortunately, it's not exactly the most interesting to me. Equipment, for the most part, is just choose the weapon and armor with the highest stats. Your jobs are locked in from the first decision you'd make in the game, so even if encounters were challenging enough to encourage more out-of-the-box thinking, the amount of changes that you're able to make are incredibly limited. I do respect the fact that the job system exists, though. It is a meaningful decision, even if it's a one-time decision. But there is one meaningful decision to make in terms of setup, and that's what spells your mages have memorized. Or, I would say this, but knowing how the franchise has generally handled status effects and debuffs for the most part, at least up until the PS2 era, most spells just didn't seem worth the effort. If you hadn't played any other Final Fantasies, like if you were perhaps playing this back in 1987, then perhaps they would have seemed a lot cooler, and I can concede that point. But that wasn't the case for me, so I just didn't foresee a real scenario where I would use the majority of these spells. For example, black mages have some spells available starting at level 6 that inflict status ailments, and they always fail against high HP enemies and always succeed against low HP enemies. But the threshold is at 300 HP, which is low enough to where just using an offensive spell, and the high level ones are going to hit pretty hard, is just gonna be better almost all of the time. And of course, we can't discuss a Final Fantasy game without bringing up the music. Nobuo Uematsu is an absolute legend, as I'm sure most of us who have played the games are aware. Obviously, the original release would have been limited by the NES's sound chip, and so the song structures are going to be a lot more basic, but he still did so much with what he had available. And the game has been re-released a million times with some new songs and new arrangements of old songs. While I personally prefer the later arrangements, as I feel the different instruments help to bring each song to life and give each of them a unique feel, there's definitely still a certain charm to be had with the original soundtrack. Songs like Matoya's Cave and Mount Gulg are my favorites from the original game, and then of course there's a handful of songs like Prelude, Opening Theme, Battle, and Victory that would become iconic series staples. The one major drawback to the original soundtrack is the lack of unique battle themes, or even any other battle theme for that matter, but this is rectified in the game's re-releases, which add new tracks for the boss fights, as well as giving Chaos his own incredible final boss track. While I may have been critical with most of my thoughts throughout this video, I do think it's worth reiterating that I do fully respect the game and what it did for the franchise. I might not necessarily love playing this game in the current day, and don't exactly plan on replaying it anytime soon. I can appreciate certain elements that became mainstays in the franchise that found their conception in this game. I already mentioned a few songs that you'll hear in virtually every single Final Fantasy game. The job system gets very heavily expanded on in later games, and the 6 jobs from this game are very frequently represented. And in games where there's no jobs, then most of them are usually represented in one of the character's fighting styles. The theme of crystals is present in most of the games going forwards. 4 is a pretty common quantity, whether it's total playable characters, party size, number of crystals, huge materia, etc. Most of the spells would become mainstays in later games, and honestly, the list goes on. So much of what makes the future games great is clearly traced back to this game, and so while my final verdict of the game is that it's fine, once again, I absolutely do respect it for what it did. And if it didn't exist, we would have never gotten Final Fantasy VII, and I may never have fallen in love with JRPGs to begin with. I don't expect this game to be very many people's favorite game, but I do still think it's worth playing, at the very least from a cultural standpoint. It's a really neat experience going back to the franchise's origins and seeing the specs that would go on to lead to the creation of whatever your favorite Final Fantasy is. My playthrough of the Pixel Remaster was only around 11 hours, so it's not a particularly huge commitment to play through, and I think the length works perfectly for this game. If it was too much longer, the novelty of the systems might wear off, but it's just about the perfect length to not overstay its welcome while still being long enough to feel like a substantial journey.